happiest Saturdays, y'all. I am Wanda Swan, and I am back with another episode of Saturday Coffee Chats for my YouTube community and Patreon users. I, if you didn't notice, maybe you did. I took a moment last week. You didn't see me last week. Um, I took a moment. I had a mental health day where I was like, you know what? Yo, I'm tired. I am so tired. And so I decided that my time would be best spent staying in bed, y'all. I stayed in bed. I was able to get some really good rest. I watched a lot of junk TV. I got up, I fixed myself breakfast. I just kind of took it slow. And I say that, but then I ended up like washing my car, hand washing my car because the pollen. I hadn't like really been in my car for almost a year and I didn't wash it and it was horrible. It was like pollen was on that thing about that thick. And so I had to get out the hand washing, my hand washing skill sets that I developed way back in the country. Um, I had to get to work. I had to get to work. I was all on top of the car. I was like on top, mm, in the air, suspended. It was interesting. And I hurt like you would not believe the next day. So, but I'm here. I took that time and I'm not gonna lie, I felt a little guilty at first because I was like, oh no, like I should be working and I want to make sure that people are having the opportunity um to get the work, to get, to get the education. Like people are out here listening and wanting to do this and that. And then I was like, kid, that is whiteness talking, the strategy of whiteness talking. That is capitalism. Rest is resistance. So lay your ass down and just stop, right? And have a Saturday where you're not running. Um, and I so enjoy these Saturday chats over coffee with my favorite mug. This is my favorite mug. My sister has a matching one that's called it says indulge. But this is my favorite mug. Hands down. No question. It's my favorite one. Um, y'all. So today we're going to be debunking some myths, right? So I often come to these Saturday episodes whenever I'm thinking through like where is my heart today? What did I learn this week? Um, what series do I want to usher out with this platform? Like, how do I want to use this space? Kind of also as I talk, I'm gonna clean my glasses because they're a little bit foggy. Um, and so I have been thinking about after this week of coaching. So this week was, I feel like I'm always saying that, oh, this week was kind of hard. I had two trainings in one day. So for those of y'all who don't know, um, I frequently am a trainer of anti-oppressive advocacy and wonderful folks, wonderful organizations, local governments. I'm often seek out my training services, especially for frontline workers who need to work on their anti-blackness or need to interrogate the ways that anti-blackness has found their way into their policies and um, how that works for minoritized survivors of violence, minoritized customers, like uh, yeah. And so I on Wednesday of this week I had a 4-hour training with uh, some folks in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it was like amazing, right? It was amazing. And then that same day, later that same day, I had trainings. I did a group training with some other folks from Cambridge, um, another group from Cambridge, and I was worn out because I go through the whole anxiety related to imposter syndrome. I go through that. That takes a couple days, no matter what, right? And it's like this is the shit that I know. I I know this more than I know anything else, but I also know um how whiteness impacts me, how whiteness strips me, right, of believing that tries to strip me of my worth. And there are definitely some places where I still need improvement. Um, so and then there's some days I'm like, "Psh, sit your raggedy ass down. We're fine." Um, but others, it's just like, yo, like, whiteness caught me slipping today. I forgot that you show up like this sometimes. Or, um, yeah, so that on top of the regular coaching, on top of having to talk through like what's happening in Palestine right now, it's just been a heavy week. And so I I want to talk about how anti-blackness brings forth myths that really sit in, like really. Mm. So I'll tell you this. Yesterday I went to Tennessee. Took a day trip to Tennessee, yes, in the middle of a gas shortage, yes. And why? Because we had to get our hair done. Mm-hmm. And yeah. So we went and it was a great time. My sister got a chance to see her grandkids who live in Tennessee. I live in Nashville. And so this is great. But on the way there, I started this new podcast. And the podcast is called The Improvement Association. I don't know if you guys have um I don't know if you all have had the opportunity to listen. If you hadn't, please do. It's very short. I think it's no more than 6 episodes, but it is a really interesting podcast. It's actually one that I am going to move into or create the rotation in for my people, my clients. So, and that's what I do. Like y'all, like my sister is she's often like, you eat, live, sleep, shit, breathe this work that you're doing because I love learning. I am a lifelong learner. And so I'm always just like, ooh, new podcast. Ooh, new book. Ooh, new insight, right? And so that's just kind of how I roll. And so there's this podcast a client had been listening to, and they were like, "Have you listened to it?" And I was like, "No, I hadn't. I hadn't heard of it." And it was like, "Oh, I'm interested in maybe us talking about it." I was like, "Well, I'll take a listen when I have free time." 4 hour drive. Of course, I got free time, so I listened. Oh, y'all, when you have the chance. So um, it is a podcast based on the um, election processes of Bladen County, North Carolina, right? Where in 2008, I think it was 2008, I'm not sure. Um, there's a huge kerfuffle, there's a huge ruckus where uh, there was voter fraud, right? Alleged voter fraud via absentee ballots within that county that sparked, it seemed like it sparked this whole implosion, right? But it was actually like a long time coming. And so it's a podcast that talks about the ways in which a town gathers or not, um, find power or not around garnering the black vote and the lengths that people will go to secure the black vote, and the ways in which black folks in that space at one time had a very um, interesting structure around a voting pack, right? Um, and how they used it, what the responses were of the white voters in the town. And it is a head trip. It is, if y'all have seen on Patreon, my Patreon folks, I put up some of the core tenets of anti-oppressive advocacy, which everything that I do is based upon this like core structure, right? And so if you had the opportunity to take a look at the proximity to whiteness tool that I uploaded a couple weeks ago, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you layer the proximity to whiteness tool over this podcast, it's gonna blow your mind. So I would love for you all to have the opportunity to listen to it, because within the next couple of weeks, I am so fascinated with the twists and turns associated with the improvement project. Y'all, please, if you do nothing else, put that on your list of things to listen to. Um, yeah, whew, it was good. It was really good. It was really validating. And it is it is whiteness acting the way that I've always seen it act, and uh, it did not differ from the structures in which I'm always looking to see what whiteness does different. Like, what's up now? What's your new strategy? But the truth of the matter is that whiteness doesn't have a new strategy, right? Because the old one worked so well. Why would you need a new strategy? Mm-mm, mm-mm. Like everything that whiteness does, y'all, we have all seen before. We have all seen before in some form, fashion, shape. We have all seen it before. It does not change. Um, it it There is a sense of elasticity, right, that exists within it. It stretches, it bends, it contorts, but it doesn't have to change. It never changes. So if you're looking for something, what is Wanda listening to today? What is Wanda reading today? That is what I will offer you. The Blatant Improvement Project, or the Improvement Association. Yeah, it is coming to you by the folks of the Serial podcast that folks lost their minds over not too long ago, and New York Times, for better or for worse. So that is what I've been doing. That on top of the fact that I am getting ready to, uh, I'm welcoming members to the second cohort of my anti-oppressive advocacy online course. And so it's been a week, y'all. I'm glad that I took the time last week, because it's been a week. It's been a week, and I needed that break. I didn't realize all of the moving pieces. I mean, I did, but I was also like, girl, you be fine. I don't know why. I don't know why I thought that. Um, mm oppression was like, just keep going, just keep moving, right? Um, yeah. So let's get into today. Let's get into today, y'all. So I want to talk about the myths, and let's debunk some of the myths that anti-blackness tells us about black people. And so I want to do that because I've also been um, listening to or re-listening to the 1619 project with my clients, right? Some of my clients, some of them haven't made it there yet. We're still early in the journey. Um, So I do this podcast wars. There's a transition within my curriculum where I'm like podcast wars, right? And so we pit two podcasts that seems to be on a very similar topic, same topic, or the topics overlap or marry in some way, and we compare them. We compare them, and then we do some brain dumps around them, right? And so, um, 1619 Project is one of those podcasts, and uh, I just finished up with episode 2, where there's a lot of conversation around the foundation of American capitalism and how American capitalism came to be. And so, actually, I don't think I have my notebook in here, so I'm going to do all this straight from the dome. Y'all ready? Huh. Okay. So, I was listening to that podcast in preparation for this past week's coaching sessions, and there are some interesting things that came up that really, I think, earlier this week I've just been kind of, the wheels have been turning and turning and turning about, oh, what can I talk about on Saturday, right? And so I think a piece of that is I'm going to talk about that episode today, as well as a couple other things, because I want us to address like the ways in which I need us to understand how, when I say anti-Blackness is a vehicle that validates violence against Black folks and people of color. Anti-Blackness is the vehicle that validates violence against Black folks and people of color, right? And so I want us to think about that in relation to 3 myths that we're going to talk about today. The first myth that we're going to talk about is the myth that Blackness is devoid of value, right? When we look at, again, proximity to whiteness tool, right? We have whiteness here, we have Blackness here, and the goal of white supremacy is you're either white or you're trying to get to whiteness, right? Because there is no value on the other side of this. There is no value in Blackness. It is devoid of worth. It is devoid of value. And as a matter of fact, it is fucking dangerous, right? So that's what we're all taught. And that is how Black folks can also be anti-Black. That is how people of color can also be anti-Black, because we hear this rhetoric that tells us what we're supposed to think about us. That tells us that what, and for non-Black people of color, it tells them what, who they should not be in company with, whom they should not keep company, right? And so that's the first one we're going to talk about today. The second one is, and I hear this often, Black people benefited from slavery too. Child. That one specifically, we're going to focus on the second episode of the 1619 Project podcast. And if you are interested, y'all, it is such an amazing episode. Please, 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 please go forth, scurry, go listen to it. The third is simply that Black folks are lazy and we don't have because we don't want, right? So those are the three. I want to take a sip of my coffee. What are y'all drinking this morning? Let's see. Oh, don't spill it on the keyboard. Clearly, I've had quite a bit of coffee already this morning. Here we are. Yeah, can't go any further than that because it'll be a catastrophe. All right, so I want to take a sip of my really good coffee this morning. Cafe Bustelo. I got to go to the nail shop today. As you can tell, it's been a while. This is the type of week I've had, y'all. Let this be a lesson. Right here is indicative of the type of week I had. This has been a no mani petty week. This has been a no mani petty 2.5 weeks. This has been a no mani petty, steady grind, get her done, get it together situation. Okay. Okay. So let's take a sip of this wonderful coffee. What are y'all drinking? Let me know. Let me know. I'm a coffee fiend. I drink coffee all throughout the day. Yes, yes. Mm, one more. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yippers. Been drinking coffee since I was 7. For better for worse, y'all don't know why. Here we are. So let's dig into this, right? So the first myth: blackness is devoid of value. Blackness is dangerous, right? So this is a myth that often shows up on my doorstep as a coach or even as a trainer. And so, what usually happens is like, yes, I'm here to come in and I'm training spaces, predominantly white spaces. And you usually have a group of folks in there who are sitting in various stages of their assimilation or identification with whiteness, right? There are some folks who are sitting in, like, on the proximity to whiteness tool. I'm going to keep using that. There are some folks who are sitting like so close to whiteness that this conversation is probably going to be a moot point for them. They don't care. And I think that's the other piece too, that people often ask, how do you do this work? Like, how do you talk to white people about their, sorry y'all, it's just hair, about their racism all day? Like, how do you do that? Because there are certain types of representation of whiteness that I just will not engage with, right? And that's safest for me as a coach. I get to choose who I want to work with, right? I don't have to work, and I don't work with everyone who seeks out training or coaching with me, because they may think that they're ready, but I can see some spaces from my intake assessment where you're not, or at least not with me, because it's so important for me to also be safe. And this is labor, right? This is labor. That's why this ain't cheap, because it's labor. Coaching is basically me sitting in spaces, um, especially when I am in training spaces. It is me sitting in spaces convincing you of something that you don't have to care about. And because you don't have to care about it, you come at you come at it with a very cavalier attitude. And that can be minimizing to my experiences and experiences of folks like me, which can be completely disrespectful. To like that's what I walk into. I'm trying to convince you of something that you can't see, that I've experienced my entire life, that because it has never landed at your doorstep in the same way that it's landed at mine, because white supremacy impacts us all, but because it has not landed at your doorstep with the same impact, the same thud that it has landed in mine, there's a different air of belief of, this is an option. This is not necessarily like a thing. You're blowing this way out of proportion, right? So this usually happens in these spaces where, because you can't control for people who could be triggering in the space, people who could be violent in the space in that way, right? And so what usually happens is we have people in there who are ready. We have people in here who have taken stock, who have somehow, some way seen the pattern, the common thread that goes across someone who understands that there are benefits that they have that are unearned, that shows up for them in ways that also harms minoritized folks, people of color. There are folks in there who completely understand that there is a relationship between whiteness and blackness that creates this relationship of strife and struggle, just due to these constructs, right? Talking solely about constructs, and I am in that thing with everybody, right? And so one of the things that I usually get, I remember I was coaching a weight loss group, and one of the things that it was it was a group coaching effort. Like this was like a 6 week coaching program where folks came in and we came every week, but different leaders took turns. It was like four women of color, three black women, right, in this space every week for 6 to 8 weeks. And we were not we were giving it to them straight, right? And we had each other's backs, and we did what we did. And so I remember when my turn came, they saved mine for last because it's hard to hear what I have to bring sometimes. And so we strategically decided to wait. It was like we gonna wait for you because you bring the heat. You bring the pepper in a different way. And I was like, that's completely fine. Like because if you plan your strategies, if you're planning, anyone who's done a multi-week strategy session, right, with folks, a multi-week coaching session, it is important to know who you're talking to know who you're dealing with, and it's also important to know when is the best time to hit them with the heat, hit them with the haha, right? And so I was the haha, and and they needed a little bit more time. So, um, but when I talked about, the anti-oppressive advocacy framework, when I talked about specifically um, the ways in which whiteness, the messages that we get from whiteness often, how it happened, the history behind it, how it shows up in our everyday life, I got hit with this idea, but blackness is devoid of value and blackness is dangerous, right? In the form of, well, what about black on black crime? I'm sorry. Well, what about the fact that, there are black neighborhoods that are just very dangerous, right? And, what about like how black people are just dangerous to themselves and not, and what about the riots and what about the looting and what about this and what about that? And so, and I also, now that I think about it, I also get into those conversations, of course, with my one-on-one clients as well. But I think it's important to understand and to help people like in those spaces, right? The opportunity came for me to have a conversation about, for one, your stats are skewed to benefit whiteness, right? So we have that conversation about, like, oh, well, it's so dangerous. Police have to stay over there, and the policing reports are this, is that, and the other. And I'm like, so there is a history that exists, right, with historical institutionalized spaces like law enforcement. There's a history that exists, right, that is a history of strife that no other groups can understand the way that black folks understand. Policing systems in this country were started in the early 1700s in South Carolina, specifically to retrieve runaway slaves or to find newly free slaves and put them back into slavery, right? So the early policing systems were a mechanism that took liberation from black folks. That's the genesis. That's the roots to your tree. And so, because your genesis is anti black, it makes complete sense that we are where we are today, where we see law enforcement becoming a militarized state that specifically disproportionately impacts black people, that is disproportionately interested in removing liberatory practices and spaces and freedoms from Black people. Now, if we take that a little step further, we can look at specifically what that means for Black neighborhoods and statistics of violence that come from Black neighborhoods, right? So, yes, let's say that you live in a Black neighborhood, right? And you are living in a Black neighborhood where there's a lot of violence or there's a lot of reported violence that's happening. Okay. So let's break down what that looks like or the factors surrounding that. So let's talk about the fact that Black neighborhoods are policed at several times the rate of white neighborhoods, right? Okay. Now, what happens? And we can say, yeah, but they have to be because they're so dangerous. Well, it's like, no, or is this the chicken and the egg, right? So let's talk about what happens when you are a part of a policing organization that already is steeped in anti-Blackness and is often looking to remove liberatory practices from a group of people and to continue to disenfranchise them. What usually happens is that you're over policing those areas, right? And so, yeah, the stats are going to be higher in Black neighborhoods. You know why? Because the patrolling is happening at a higher rate in Black neighborhoods. Okay. Then there's the interfacing with law enforcement is happening at a higher percentage in Black neighborhoods, right? What we also know is that the discontent, the tension that exists can also mean that those moments of interfacing with the neighborhood and law enforcement can be highly contentious, which means that violence can also occur in larger numbers, right? And so let's even put that to the side, right? Let's put that to the side. But what I can say, there is a difference between a white neighborhood, a predominantly white space, or a space that's considered non-threatening, non-urban, non-dangerous, having a police patrol around maybe once every what, 6 hours, right? Versus predominantly Black neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are targeted specifically for this belief of threat, right? For these high rates of encounters, potential crime. And there's a patrol system, a patrol car, right? A patrolling factor that's ever present in that space. And what do you think happens when, if we're still looking at this under this idea of the truth that this is a policing system that's steeped in anti-Blackness? What do you think happens when people are suspicious of Black people versus suspicious of activities, right? And you have a gun and you have a badge, right? Right. So I have that conversation, right? This idea of that Blackness is devoid of value, that Black neighborhoods can't be saved, that Black folks are inherently dangerous, right? Um, and I often counter that with all that Black folks have endured in this world, in this just in this country, to say that Black folks are dangerous because is interesting given the fact that this country is still fucking standing. Because understand you me that if white people had experienced a tenth of the type white identified, white assimilated folks had experienced a tenth of the type of oppression and violence and disenfranchisement and suffering, um, and dehumanizing that Black folks have suffered, white folks would have blown this whole earth up 8 times, but actually once, because white folks will only have to do it one time. and that shit will never happen again. So when we're hearing conversations where they're veering towards this idea of Black people being dangerous, Black people are inherently being a threat, right? I think it's important for us to remember that we have to consider the source. And not only that, like when I'm thinking about research, when I'm thinking about statistics, right? Um, we have to remember the source. We also have to remember that whiteness protects whiteness. And so the same things that are happening in Black neighborhoods are happening in other neighborhoods, including white neighborhoods, but whiteness protects whiteness. And so there are so many people uh, who have enacted crime, who have exerted violence over people and were never arrested. How often do we hear the stories of folks who um, steal police cars, who uh, get into physical altercations with officers, who uh, take a lot of liberties that are just not afforded to Black folks and live to tell the tale, right? Uh, who live to see another day, who are seen as children, even when they're 26 years old. No, this is just a kid blowing off steam, right? Um, there are two Americas, and whiteness wants it that way. And the ways in which not only are there two Americas, but there's an agenda to ensure that there continues to be two Americas. And one of the tools for doing that is this first myth, right? You have to stay away from those people because they're dangerous. But staying away from those people also means that you don't get a chance to see behind the curtain and the ways in which Black communities have been disenfranchised, the ways in which Black communities um, have been targeted, have been the ways in which Black folks and other folks of color in general, right, have been victims of ethnic cleansing, the ways in which culture has been destroyed. Like you won't be able to see that because you're so afraid of what someone told you about what Blackness is. All right. So the second myth, Black people benefited from slavery. This is something that I hear often also, and it really like irks my spirit, as you can tell. Um, so I hear this often from white folks in training sessions. It's always training sessions, y'all, because I cannot control who sits up in my spaces in the training session. Okay. And so I have a whole flock of different types of white folks just coming in, acting out. I've had someone to ask me, how do you feel about going against Dr. King's dream? How does that make you feel? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you explain? Well, what you are talking about today is the antithesis of what Dr. King wrote about, of what Dr. King talked about. And I just think Dr. King would not be interested in such divisive language. And I was like, which Dr. King are you talking about? The Black Dr. King or the white Dr. King that y'all created? Because when Dr. King died, um, he was probably one of the most hated Black men in America. This same Dr. King who was murdered in a suit, who spoke, who was a religious leader and spoke of peace, and he was still murdered in a suit. You can't get no, like, there is no other um, form, like, image of respectability, right? Of being the, yeah, like what form of blackness would you prefer? Because all he did was say that he felt that black folks had rights to the same rights that white folks had. So, what I get a lot from these spaces is black folks benefited from slavery. One of the reasons why they say that is, of course, we all know you all were savages. Black folks were savages. Black folks um, were not civilized. Black folks were saved. Like black folks had no religion. Black folks didn't know about Jesus Christ, right? And if it weren't for slavery, you will still be running around lost without your God, right? And it's like, first of all, shut up. Africa's been practicing Christianity longer than all of us been living. All of us, like Christianity was present, ever present on the continent well before white folks hopped off and decided to pick up some black folks on the way home. Um, well before. And the myth that black folks didn't know Jesus until white folks taught us is not only highly insulting, highly insulting, but it's also incorrect. Sorry, I gotta take a sip of coffee. I'm wishing for something stronger, but this will do. Mhm. One sec. Mm, 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 mm. So, but I think the other argument that comes up is white folks, black folks benefited from slavery because, um, because of the ways in which black folks were able to have access to the American dream. Look how far you come, though, right? Which I don't even see how people can fix their face, their mouth, their brain to think, speak, say these things, but it's usually what happens, right? That's what comes up. And so I always find this interesting. And again, like I think the second episode of the 1619 project. I mean, just listen to the 1619 project in general, right? There's a lot of hoopla and talk around banning it, right? In school systems, there are a lot of school systems that were trying to adopt the 1619 project to tell an more accurate story of history. And now there are legislations that are working to try to ban it because of the divisiveness. The truth can be divisive, but so let do it. Uh, I think the other piece, though, is so important. Looking at the second episode of the 1619 Project is an episode where they talk specifically about how America was built on the backs of enslaved labor of Black folks. And specifically through the eyes of the growth of the popularity of cotton, right? And so it is this mashup of cotton is king, how cotton became king, but also um, how much America depended on Black bodies to survive, and what happened when whiteness overshot itself and scaled too big too quickly, and the way that those patterns show up in the later instances, similar actions that happens within our governmental system. And overall, what she talks about in that episode of the podcast is how um, there is no institution under the sun of America, right? That does not, in some way, shape, or form, structure itself um, or pattern itself after capitalism, American capitalism. American capitalism specifically is a brand of capitalism that absolutely depends on a black laboring force, that absolutely depends on anti-blackness in order to drive home wealth and and resources, right? And so she talks about the structure of the plantation and the myths and the facts around it, and how for some people, like this idea of the plantation system was one where there were few slaves in the field, an overseer, small farm, and a small family, white family that's benefiting from it, right? Still terrible, still unreasonable, but also just a sign of the times what was done, right? And again, as I always say, whiteness is a strategy. And being able to, this second episode is an episode that shows how much of a conscious strategy whiteness is, right? And so we have this, picture perfect scene of this small farm and these happy slaves, and they're learning religion and they're learning civility and they're learning how to do dot 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 dot, and they're making their way in this world, and they're happy to serve, and they need to be led, and it is a mutual exchange of goods for lessons and culture, um, and all that's bullshit, right? Because what we find out is that I put some essential oils in my hair, and so they are very much giving me life today. And so I keep touching up here because it's like I feel like it's a little, sometimes, see right here, comes out at the temple sometimes, like it drips down. So, but little rosemary, little honey nips, little this, little that, Anywho, uh, it was so random. But it smells really good in here, y'all. Y'all should be here. Um, so what we find out is that the average plantation, right, in the South, the average plantation, like, you can't grow cotton in a very small farm. It's just not a thing that you can do, right? And I think that's also the thing that whiteness does really well, is that it whiteness works really hard to uphold a system but convince people that the system doesn't exist, and that what happens are individual acts of, spurts of genius that just happens to happen, and just white people just all happen to have the same idea, because white folks are superior and they just happen to be thinking the same thing at the same time, and there's no system here that like grants benefits to a certain group of people so that they can do it. It's just that white people are magical and they have the power to do that, right? So, okay. So, what we know though is that that's not the case. Cotton cannot you need a lot of land. Okay. You need a lot of land to go into the cotton business. And not only that, you also have to understand that cotton, the land that you grow cotton on, can only be viable for 3 years at a time. So not only do you need a lot of land, but you need to also understand that you're going to be rotating that motherfucker, right? And so that's expensive. And you need people to work that. And so no, this is not like a plantation of like we only had 10 slaves, but we were in the cotton bit. No, no, and not saying that there were folks who own, there were not people who owned small numbers of slaves. There absolutely were, but these people were not large cotton farmers, right? Whenever you people say, "Oh, well, we just had a small cotton plantation," they're lying. There is no such thing as a small cotton plantation. Okay. Um, so what we find out is that whiteness is a strategy. And do you know what came with this strategy of capitalism? What we found out in this second episode is that plantations, cotton plantations, were equivalent to Apple, were equivalent to Microsoft of today, right? I'm talking about a structure where there was a hierarchy and there were middle managers and there were credentialing, okay, where there were professional development opportunities, right? Where there were manuals created on not only how to do this work, especially after the cotton gin, right? The creation of the cotton gin and how that essentially did the work of almost 100 people, right? Of cleaning, de-seeding, right? The cotton, the pound of cotton, seeds from the cotton, right? So there were manuals that taught you about how to talk to slaves, how to manage slaves, what to feed slaves, okay? There were quotas. There were data tracking essentials and resources, right? I need you to understand this, right? Because there were middle managers. It was a robust system, right? There wasn't just, oh, this overseer here talks to the mass. No, there was a whole system, a sophisticated system, right? That mirrors a lot of the structures of business in America today, right? Think about your call centers, right? Is an example of what was used in that space in that episode, right? The structure of the call center is very similar to the structure of the cotton plantation. And when we talk about quotas and we're talking about meeting your metrics and we're talking about what happens, what type of punishment ensues when you don't meet your metrics, that is all, um, this is the genesis of that. And so this idea that Black folks benefited from slavery is ridiculous, especially when we start talking about how when it was realized, when the value of cotton was actualized, right? And the franticness of, oh my gosh, I don't have enough land. What am I going to do? The government stepped in and said, oh, don't worry about it. We're just going to take this land from indigenous folks and then we'll sell it back to white folks at a fraction of the price, right? And even in those instances, the ways in which Black bodies were used to acquire the land in what was called as they were called slave back bonds. What does that mean, Wanda? That simply means that you will go to the bank to get a loan. And instead of putting up your land for capital because it was worth nada, you will put up your slaves. You will put up Black people because Black people were valuable. Slaves were valuable to this work. So much so, if I can remember this correctly, at the height of the cotton boom, railroads, all of the railroads and all of the factories in this country at that time were still not as valuable. I'm talking dollar amount, were not valued as being more expensive than Black folks. At the height of the cotton boom, cotton was not king, slaves were. And you could get more money from owning slaves, right? And not only that, that also, if you listen to the podcast, the slave back buns also led way to slavery becoming a part of the international market, where London markets, UK markets were able to consolidate these buns and also earn a profit, even though at that point the UK had banned slavery. So this was an opportunity for folks who never saw a slave in person to benefit off slaves. So no, black people did not benefit from slavery. As a matter of fact, that is another insult. Whiteness and white people solely benefited from the structure of slavery. And not only that, that structure is being replayed throughout time. Even the bailout system, what you'll find in that episode, the bailout systems that happened in 2008, like you see that in 1837, because what happened is whiteness overshot itself and overproduced cotton, right? And the demand dropped. And the banks had the option. The banks had the option of saying, you know what? This was not a good idea. There's a lot of money that's being made around here. This is not a good idea though, because this is a fickle mark. Like this is a really big gamble. We've made our money. Let's just stop. But do you know what the bank said? Slavery is too big to fail. Where have you heard that? Slavery is too big to fail. Capitalism was too big to fail. So, and the last one, uh, black folks are lazy. My grandmama always said, and this is something that I carry with me. She said, it's amazing, and she's no longer with us. She said, it's always amazing to me how white folks say black folks are lazy. And we only started becoming lazy when we stopped working for free. What we know is that there is this, especially for folks who familiar with the proximity to whiteness too. I'm talking about that a lot today. Um, it's really important. Like it's if you all are following me on social media, like have the opportunity to look it up if you're not on the Patreon. If you should be a patron, but if you're not, what are you doing? Um, but the hustle that whiteness sells is that lazy people are folks who complain and not work. They complain about how unfair everything is. They complain about um, how things are unfair, and instead of them working, they're looking for handouts, right? So that's the hustle that white supremacy sells about quote unquote lazy people, which is coded for, we know, for black folks, right? And so we hear that black folks are lazy. We hear that black folks don't want, they don't have because they don't want, because they don't want to work for anything. We hear that that's the same reason why black folks don't vote. We hear that black folks are not interested in thinking about the future, that black folks are just not equipped, right, to have these sophisticated ideations, right, around um, and notions around creating self-sustaining systems, right? And we know that that's incorrect. We know that that's bullshit, right? Because what we also know is that Tulsa happened. We know that um we know that Tulsa happened. We know that Black Wall Street happens. We know that there are there is something dangerous about the gathering of black folks to whiteness. We know what happened when Reconstruction came and went with the swiftness. We know what happened when slave codes became black codes, which I'll talk about in some upcoming Saturday coffee chats, right? We know what happens. What happens is whenever Black folks attempt to whenever Black folks attempt to create self-sustaining spaces, right, to circulate the Black dollar and limit it to Black spaces, when Black folks attempt to create structures that will lead to independence and get us out of disenfranchisement, whiteness legit blows it the fuck up. Okay. We know what happened to Fred Hampton. Like uh we know what happens whenever Blackness has the audacity to want to stand and be seen and be counted within its full scope of humanity and rights. We know what happens when Black folks attempt to create avenues and ways and spaces for themselves. Whiteness reacts. And so this idea that Black folks keep themselves down because they don't want anything and then they make excuses about it, right? Goes very much against the history of white terrorism against Black communities. It goes against the history of disenfranchisement of Black folks. It goes against just the history of slavery in general, right? Um, and I think one of the spaces is also like the conversations around generational wealth and bootstrapping and that bullshit. And bootstrapping and generational wealth are two sticking points for me where I will probably argue you all day. Like there's not yeah, there's a lot of things that I will argue about all day. That's just my nature. Um, but if you want to get me upset, yeah, generational wealth, the conversation around generational wealth will do it. So, specifically, let's talk for a brief second. And like I said, I'm gonna talk about this more in depth in future episodes. But let's talk about for a brief second about slave codes, right? And then I'm gonna compare slave codes to Black codes in a future episode so that y'all can see that really ain't shit changed. Okay. Uh so slave codes were originally created, I think, in the Virginia colonies, shortly after the idea of slavery as being based solely on race and on the presence of African blood in um, what it means to be Black and designating Black folks to um, a specific caste system in America. And there were slave codes that came that basically shortly thereafter that decision that the role was to remind and govern these Black bodies. And a lot of it had to do with establishing who was Black in these colonies and who were not. And also establishing who will forever be considered Black and who could never not be considered white. And so one of the ways that they did that was, of course, establishing that all folks of African blood, one drop rule, would be considered Black and therefore would be designated to this particular class. The other piece of it, right, in effort to cover themselves, to cover um, white rapists, and also white folks who were rape apologists, who understood the value of quote unquote breeding Black folks and who understood the culture of using non-consensual assault as a power differential. Also made it a law that that race was determined by the birth of the mother. So even if a slave was pregnant by a white man, that child would never be considered white, right? Which is kind of like, oh, let me just cover myself so we don't have no new ass white black folks around here, right? Ridiculous. So, but what the slave codes also did, right? Because remember, there were free black folks here, free people of African descent were here in this country before this idea of slavery, right? Race-based slavery took place, and what happened to those folks is that these people were also impacted by the slave codes, even though they were not considered slaves. They were impacted because there were laws that were specific to black existence, right? One of those laws is that when a black person dies, they were not able to leave free or no. They were unable to leave. It was illegal for them to leave their wealth, the accumulation of what they owned, right? Their effects to their family members. So if we have free and we there were free folks of African descent here who were landowners, who were homeowners, who were business owners, who were upstanding citizens, who worked in local government, right? When these people passed away, their wives, their children, their families, right, their husbands were unable to receive the goods that they had accumulated over their lifetime. And so I use that as an example because I think this idea of black folks don't have because they don't want, I don't think people really understand that the details, the devil that's in the details of whiteness, right? And the ways that whiteness will work, will seemingly think about any and every possible way to disenfranchise and to create a system that the overall goal, right, of white supremacy, of anti-blackness, is for there to be a a sustaining demographic of laborers. That is the only way capitalism works. There has to be an assigned group of laborers, and their only job will be to work and die laboring for other people. That's it. And so, if that is the goal, if that is how money gets made in America, which it is even today, when we're looking at like the Amazons and all of the other big companies who have complaints around working conditions, around uh, the ways in which it is just unlawful, the way that they're treating, right, their employees, it's because it is a system that is still here today. The belief that there should be a laboring force sacrificed for the greater good of people higher up. That's it, right? When I think about that conversation, like of, well, why black folks just don't save? Well, why black folks just don't? Like, it's like, get the fuck out of my face. How about that? Because what are you talking about? Like, what are you really talking about here? What are we saying? There is no way. And the system was designed this way. There is no way that black folks could compete with a 400, 500 year head start when we were literally told, it was mandated and it was written in law that we could not own anything. And even the things that we did own, they can't be passed on to our people. Like, do you understand that as a concept? Like, you're literally cutting families off. There is, and the reason why is because there was never, again, whiteness is a strategy formed from an incomplete thought. There was never a strategy past laboring. Because you know what happens past laboring? You die. That was the goal. That is why folks like Stacey Abrams got clocked and got hurt, got hit really hard around this idea of her buying $1 million home. Because what, Stacey Abrams, what do you think you're doing? Prospering out here. You're outside of your laboring force. Yeah, like you going and working in the trenches and getting the votes and doing that and saving democracy. Whoop, whoop, whoop. But what you mean you got $1 million? Where you get $1 million from? It's a lot of white people who don't have it. Wait a minute. I don't trust you. I don't trust you to have $1 million because you're not supposed to. You're not who I thought you were because you have moved outside the laboring force. Y'all, it is a trip. It is a trip. Black folks are lazy except when it comes to building this country. Black folks are lazy except when it comes to raising white children. Black folks are lazy except when it comes to inventing all of the things that make life easier in this country. Black folks are lazy until we build our Tulsas and we build our Black Wall Streets and we dare to want the next generation to not have to suffer and toil. Black folks are lazy until dot dot dot. So what? What do we do with all this information? I think that's the question that you ask yourself. How are you able to debunk these myths? What are you doing every day to debunk these myths and create space for Black voices, for Black expertise? How are you creating counter arguments? How are you amplifying the truth? Right? That's what this is about. How do you create space with the privilege that you have and make room for the truth? How do you do the work of countering the argument that the truth is divisive? How are you continuing to educate yourself? How are you actively unraveling oppression and anti-Blackness? Because these myths sound ridiculous once we debunk them. And intellectually, we know that these myths are ridiculous. But what we also know is that they are also the infrastructure of anti-Blackness, capitalism, anti-Black rhetoric like this validates capitalist systems that promote a laboring force. It's okay because Blackness is devoid of value. It's okay because Black folks are dangerous anyway. Like, let's just have them here. It's okay because Black folks benefited from slavery too. Like, it was good for them too. You got a free field trip out of it. Field trip. It's okay because Black folks are lazy. They needed a work ethic. There's so much more that I can say, but I won't because it is. I've been on here for an hour and 15 minutes. But good people, I ask that you do the work. You keep doing the work. Every day you keep showing up. Every day you do the one thing. Every day, the one thing until it becomes the other one thing, and then the other, and then the other. We have to dismantle the system of capitalism. There is no reforming capitalism. There is no reforming the policing systems. We have to start over, and we have to know that the system that we're in is only an option, y'all. It's an option. It doesn't have to be this way. It is a beautiful Saturday. I think I might try to get these done and get my feet done. Um, but I also want y'all to breathe deeply today. Take in the knowledge that you learned today and do the work. Do the good work. Yeah, plant some seeds today. I'll see y'all next Saturday. Um, and where I think it's a really good opportunity to talk about slave codes and black codes. And so next Saturday, that's what we're going to be talking about, okay? Y'all take it easy. Have a great Saturday.